From the Spec Network, this is Fragmented, an Android developer podcast where we talk about building good software and becoming better Android developers. I'm Don Felker.
And I'm Kaushik Gopal.
Welcome to the show.
If you work on an Android app, and if you're listening to this podcast, I'm going to presume you do, you will know that when your user reports a problem or a crash, it's the absolute worst feeling. To make matters worse, they might one-star your app, go on Twitter and complain about the app, and if they're feeling particularly merciless, probably go on Reddit or something and post it there. But you know what? They have absolutely every reason to. If you treat your customers basically as an offsite QA team, it's rude to them and it's just bad for business. As developers, we don't want to rely on customers to report errors. Instead, we want to catch this much early on. Ideally, you just have automated tests and these tell you when there's a problem. But as we've talked about on the show multiple times, that's not always as easy as we want it to be, because writing tests can be hard. That's why Sentry, our sponsor for today's show, tells you about errors in your code before your customers have a chance to encounter them. Not only do they tell you about the errors, they also give you helpful details that help you fix these errors. For example, how many users were impacted by this bug, the complete stack trace if it's a crash, the commit ID when this error was released, the engineer who wrote this line of code that was busted, that and a whole lot more. If your code is broken, let's fix it together. That's Sentry's tagline. Love it. You can check them out at sentry.io/for/Android. Sentry is a pretty common word. It's actually a pretty cool name for the service if you know the English meaning of the word. But I want to make sure you get that domain name right. It's sentry.io. Once again, sentry.io/for, as in FOR/Android. Check them out today and fix your errors before your users encounter them. Thanks for sponsoring today's show, Sentry.
This episode of Fragmented is brought to you by nevercode.io. With nevercode.io, you can develop 20% faster with the cloud-based continuous integration and delivery platform for iOS, Android, Cordova, Ionic, React Native, and Flutter projects. Now, just recently, Nevercode has announced that they are a CI for Flutter, and they now have an integration with Bitbucket. Therefore, now all Flutter developers who have Bitbucket repos can enjoy the same benefits as everyone else who has also been enjoying Nevercode, etc. Also, other good news coming down the pipe, GitLab integration is coming soon. Now here's also something that's really cool. If you're being a developer, now here's something else that's really cool. If you're a developer, namely a Flutter developer, and you're releasing an iOS app, they just also released something known as automatic code signing for iOS that doesn't require a Mac. Think about that for a second. That's kind of cool. With automatic code signing, you can have CodeMagic generate a signing certificate and match a provisioning profile for you and use them for code signing. Now, CodeMagic makes signing Flutter apps for iOS easier by eliminating some of the steps required in conventional iOS code signing processes. For example, you no longer need a Mac to generate the signing certificates, or you have to trouble yourself with obtaining the correct provisioning profile because CodeMagic does all that for you with its automatic code signing feature at no cost. And CodeMagic will stay free for all developers. So if you're interested and you want to check out this new feature from Nevercode, you can go to nevercode.io. And if you want to try CodeMagic, which is the automatic code signing for Nevercode and Flutter apps, you can go to www.codemagic.io. Thanks again, Nevercode. Kaushik, how you been?
I've been good, sir. How have you been? How's the new year treating you so far?
New Year's been pretty good, just staying productive as I like to do. How about you?
Pretty much the same. I mean, we've talked about this, I think, maybe in a previous episode, but usually with New Year's, I like to sort of give myself a fresh start. Not necessarily with resolutions, but yeah. So that's been going good. I've been trying to get back into blogging. I know we've talked about that as well. So yeah, just trying different things,
Yeah, we'll have to have a discussion about blogging someday on the show.
Yeah, especially with the tooling. If folks are interested, I know Don has really pinned down process. I have like another process. And so folks are interested, let us know and we can tell you how we do it.
Yeah, definitely. But in the meantime, let's rope this back in here. Back on episode 148, we talked about some of the architecture that you're using over at Instacart. And in the process of that, we asked folks to send in some questions either on the Discord chat server, which you can find the link for that on fragmentedpodcast.com if you're not already a part of it, or send us in through Twitter or whatever. And so we collected a bunch of those questions and we wanted to answer them on today's show. And so Kaushik, I think let's handle some of those questions, but before we do so, I think it would be good if you can kind of give us a rundown of that architecture again for the folks that really didn't listen to 148, maybe just so they can kind of get an understanding of some of the key terms we're going to use, and then we'll hop into the questions. What do you think?
Absolutely. I can do a brief recap of the terminology, and I can maybe go through, because we did go through in like a lot of detail, like the terminology. So I'll just briefly touch the terms and then maybe talk about the salient features, and then like we can field some questions, because I think that'll be interesting. Because the community did send in like some pretty good questions. Yeah,
sounds good.
So the different terms that we've used in this sort of architecture is so we have screens. Screens are typically anything that's viewable. So it could be activities, fragments, views, custom views, anything. I just like refer to them as screens. Any event. So we also have this terminology called events, and events could basically be anything that causes change. So it could be UI driven events. So if you have a user clicking buttons, typing text, all that is driven into this view model, which we also have. We have a view model, and everything's driven to the view model through events. It could also be system driven events. So screen load, rotation, like we can get into like some of those specifics if you have questions, but basically anything that causes system level changes, even those are driven into the view model. So the idea is anything that could potentially change the state of the world of your application, you pipe them through as events into the view model. As I mentioned, we have a view model. So typically the way we name this is like your screen name view model. So if it's a home activity, then I call this home activity view model. If you have home fragment view model. And the idea is basically intuitively, if I have a screen, then I know that it should always have a corresponding view model. So that's basically the intention. Inside this view model, what happens is once you get the event, that event is converted into a result object. And this result, we actually convert it into an LCE of a result, because this is the
What's an LCE again for people who don't know?
So LCE is a very simple like wrapper. It could be like a sealed class in Kotlin. Essentially, it represents your data in three states: the loading state, the content state, and the error state.
Yep.
So if the most intuitive example for this is if you have a network request, as soon as you place the network request, you send down first an object wrapped, the same object wrapped in a loading state. And this basically allows you to react to it in the UI if you care to. You can maybe show a spinner, you can do different things. If it's content, that basically typically means that your network request is done and you're like displaying something. So the content is successfully shown, right? And if something goes wrong, then you obviously want to like map that into an error state, and you can send it down as an error state. Now, obviously, this is an LCE of result, and you typically want to send that in as an observable because, like I said, the LCE of content, it doesn't, in the case of a network request, typically it's a single, so it doesn't matter as much. But you could have like streaming requests. You could be maybe listening to the database. Like all of these things come down as like an observable of an LCE of result. So just a minor point. Alrighty, so that gets converted to the LCE of result. Now, this event to result, typically what happens is this is like inside your view model. So it actually shouldn't necessarily have as much UI related work. And in fact, if you want to take it a step forward and want to share this action, because there's a good chance that more than one screen would perform the same use case, right? In the backend, that same network request could be hit from like different screens. Yeah. So what you typically want is you want to be able to share these use cases. And so if that's the case, what you want to do is you want to maybe have that event converted to an LCF result shared in a service class and maybe a different view model. Like we'll talk about that a little today because there was a question that came up along those lines. Essentially, if you want to make it shareable, then what you can do is you can in fact change that event into an action, which is just another object that represents the state. that action can be converted to an LCF result, and you can share that in other places. And lastly, what happens is this result, obviously it's an LCF result, but I'll just call it result for now. You can map these result objects into finally what is called a view state.
Okay.
The view state is essentially the simplest data class. It's like a value object that represents what you see on the screen. So for all practical purposes, if I look at my view state object, it should tell me what I should be seeing on my UI.
Mm-hmm.
And the objective, the idea is here, the view state is what is sent down from the view model to the screen. And in your screen, the only logic you should be having is super simple binding logic between this view state and the different Android views you have. So you should basically just have like my text view dot set text, view state dot text to be shown, or if it's like, if it's a text, if it's like an input field, whatever, it should describe exactly what you see in your screen. So that's what the view state is, a one-to-one mapping of what is displayed on the UI in the screen. There's also this other concept called the view effects. We went into great detail in the last episode about this, and the idea here is sometimes you want one-time sort of UI changes. For example, if I'm displaying an alert dialog, if I'm showing a toast message, if I'm navigating, if I'm moving from one place to another, what you want is one-time effects. So I call these view effects. And this is also sent in parallel. Like you can listen to the view state stream from the view model, but you can also independently listen to the view effects stream in your view model. And the idea there is you can send these one-time effects, but these aren't persisted. View state is persisted, so that if you have screen rotations, if you have other things that are done, when you come back, you maintain the state. View effects, you don't want to maintain the state because it's by definition, it's one-time effects. So that covers like the terminology. So far, so good?
Yeah, so far, yep. I mean, if folks are interested in that was a lot of information in a short period of time. Right. If you're kind of like your head spinning right now, like, whoa, what the heck just happened? Highly recommend that you go back and listen to episode number 148, where we kind of dive into each one of these in detail about what they're for, why they're used, and Kaushik really kind of dives into them and really gives you a really good explanation. But I think that's a good recap for the folks that have listened. Now, given that, and if the people are feeling like, well, I'm kind of overwhelmed, and even now I'm hearing it again for the first time in probably a few weeks, is there any like negative downsides to all of this type of, architecture or anything of that nature?
Absolutely. So again, like this is not like everything is not rainbow and sunshine. And like, throughout the years, we've been like trying to find different architecture patterns. The thing, if you had to pick the downsides to this pattern, the first downside I would say is if you have a drop dead simple screen, for example, literally it's just like, hey, I have the single network request. It's a user profile page. Literally, I have these 3 fields. It's never going to change. It's a super simple screen. Do I have to use this architecture pattern? It's up to you, right? Like for that, this might seem like overkill because there is like some level of boilerplate that you have to establish at the beginning. That being said, because this is a question that's come, like especially for like newer Android engineers, they're like, hey, this seems like pretty heavy-handed for something that simple. All I want is just like this simple screen, right? What I can tell you is while that might seem like a downside, in almost all these cases in my experience, those screens that we thought were very simple gradually start to develop more functionality. And that's usually how, you either like get messed up God classes, God objects, or you start to have complexity in your functionality. So typically what I like to do is I was like, no, it's also like once you get familiar with the pattern, it's actually pretty simple because it's just like, you know exactly what needs to be done. And it's like sort of copy pasting for the most part to get the boilerplate, like making sure you have a view model, like all the events are being sent in a specific way. What I found is once you have that in, because it makes debugging, testing, and a lot of these other things super straightforward, specifically in this case, adding functionality becomes really easy because all you have to do is you just have to add that one trace. You have the event, the new event that you're adding in, the new result that's forming in, and how the view state changes towards that. And if you look at your PR, it'll just be so clean because all you're doing is you're tracing back from the input to the output, right? So in my mind, while that is like one of the biggest downsides, if you plan to like sort of use that screen, or that screen is going to change functionality, I would still say suck up the costs initially and reap the benefits for like the future.
Okay, makes sense.
Have you found that in your sort of usage to be a similar thing? Like, well, what are your thoughts? Like, because that's like a common question in general, right? Like, hey, do I like pay the cost now? And like for something this simple, can I just use my Android view.set text directly, or do I have to like go through this process? Like, how do you answer those questions?
It kind of really depends on the situation. If it's going to be, like the about screen of an application where we're just going to be showing the version, some disclaimer or whatever, and it's just kind of a real static kind of page, but it does require like an HTTP request to get some legal data, whatever. In that case, I'll kind of follow Yagni of just like, just do whatever is going to work for us to get this out the door, because we're not really going to have to change it. And then I kind of use a very similar approach that you covered in a previous episode, where if you feel like you're touching something a few times, then it might be a good sign that I might need to refactor it into something else. And I've seen clients do this as well. Like, hey, we're going to build this the real easy way first, and then we'll kind of encounter some pain with it. Like, oh, wow, we also need to use it over here and over here and over here. And all of a sudden we're like, oh, that was the wrong decision. We should have built it with this new architecture that we have, or that you have designed here. Now, however, if I know that screen is, that very simple screen is going to be used in all these other different types of places, then at that point, I'll usually say, hey, let's just stick with the current architecture that we have and kind of, pay the piper now like you're doing.
Right. So that's one downside. The other downside is it is pretty RX heavy, like RX Java heavy. Now, a common question that comes, especially when I gave the talk last time, like usually the folks ask, hey, do I need RX Java for this pattern? The truth is you don't. You don't, in quotes, need RX Java. There's live data. There's maybe like with Kotlin coroutines, like with some combination of both of those, you probably, and maybe data binding, you probably could get to that point where like you don't need RX Java. Quite honestly, I haven't actually used the alternatives and tested this pattern out with that, so I can't comment. But if you use the pattern, and I have like a sample repository where I like show this pattern like in a simple movie searching case. If you see that it's pretty RX heavy, you should know what the scan operator is. You should know like what observables are, how I'm doing like mapping between them. I'm composing certain operators. So it requires at least intermediate levels of knowledge for RX Java. So I would say like that's probably the other downside, because not knowing RX Java definitely puts you at a disadvantage in using this pattern.
Yeah, I think that's probably the biggest hurdle to this initially when folks are getting into something like this. Even though RX is used heavily, I would probably go as far to argue to say that it's not used everywhere. There's a lot of places where people still don't use it. They might use coroutines now with Kotlin,
right?
And they never touch RX for whatever reason. They just don't do it. There's hundreds of thousands of developers out there, and I've seen many times where you'll introduce RX Java or something like this and show them this pattern, and it's like this huge like wall of like, whoa, I have no idea how RX really works. Now I have to learn this scan operator and like all these weird bifunctions and like what is it doing behind the scenes, and like, okay, now I'm using switch map. Why am I using switch map? And wait, I have an observable of observables. Why are we doing this? And so there's a lot of like really abstract stuff that has to be learned. So I felt that learning that stuff has always kind of been the biggest challenge. Right. As long as you have someone who can walk somebody through or act as a coach for someone that's being onboarded and can answer all the questions, then I feel it's usually a win there.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I mean, it also is part of that was also part of the challenge. Like I also wanted to keep it which is also why I don't like calling it like MVI or something else. It obviously is heavily inspired by those patterns, but I want to try and keep it as close to MVVM. So it really is not any different from MVVM, which at this point has become more or less standard. So it becomes one less thing for like folks to learn, right? And like you said, I mean, if you want to use these like in your day-to-day like world or like in companies where you have more than just senior developers, it has to in some ways be pleasant to like developers who are coming on, right? And you're absolutely right. In those cases, this definitely tends to become like pretty tricky, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it definitely can get really challenging. So do you want to hop in some of these questions that the community had asked?
Absolutely. Let's do it. All right. So yeah, firstly, I want to thank folks. Like especially in the Discord channel and like through Twitter, like folks have been amazing, and like they've been giving a lot of great feedback, and in many cases, folks have also been jumping in and helping the other folks answer some of these questions. So this is like as good as it gets, right? So we're extremely like thankful that folks are doing this. Thank you for asking the questions, and thank you also for helping other folks in answering these questions.
Most definitely.
Alrighty, I want to start with this one. So this one is a quick one. Both Viresh and Prithviraj asked on the Discord channel, and both of these are like sort of similar questions. They asked specifically around the view effects thing, right? So they were like, hey, how do I handle like the screen navigation after the button action? Because if I store that in the view state and it remains in the view state, if I go to a different screen and come back to the screen, won't that again put me in a loop where like because it's stored in the view state, it just takes me like it repeats the action? And that you're right, that will happen if you store it in the view state. Again, there's a part of the episode 148 where we go dive into great detail with why this whole view effects thing came into play, and this is precisely the use case for that. So Viresh and Prithviraj, I hope that answers. And also in the Discord channel, like some folks have pointed you towards that. So view effects definitely is the solution for this.
Well, and what, if you wouldn't mind explaining like what's why does a view effect solve that? And like if you were to give me the elevator pitch.
So essentially, part of this pattern is you expose two streams from the view model: an observable of a view state and an observable of view effects. Right now, the nature of like observables are like you're listening to these effects, right? The observable of a view state, if you look at the pattern, remembers the view state. So it is a subject, but it's a behavior subject. So it actually it remembers the state. What you use for the view effects, though, is a publish subject.
Okay.
Right? And again, I say subject, you could use relay, substitute with whatever you want to use in that pattern. That isn't too important to this question. Mm-hmm. Because it's a published subject, you listen to the event, but after you listen to the view effect. After you listen to the view effect and you perform the action, it's gone. When you come back, that publish subject doesn't remember the state, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's why it doesn't act, that it doesn't like for those one-time effects, it's perfect. So it says show toast. Okay, it comes down the observable. I've displayed the toast. It's lost. The published subject does not remember the state, right? However, with view state, because it's a behavior subject and it's encoded in that data class object called view state, if you add a show toast as a property, if you encode that into the view state, then it always remains. When you come back, it'll remain and you'll keep showing the toast, and you don't want that, which is why you don't put those kind of one-time effects in the view state. You actually have another similar concept called view effect, and you actually send that down.
Okay.
Does that sort of like, it's not necessarily an elevator, it's a longer elevator pitch, but hopefully it answers the question.
No, it does. It provides the detail. I can kind of see why it's used now. So that's what I was looking for. Appreciate it.
Alrighty. The next question we got was by J. Alex Dev on the Discord. This is the question. Let me it's a pretty good question. So he asks, how would you manage the state that you would want to look the same across concurrently visible screens? So let's say you have two fragments that show a stock price that show the full screen normally, right? But in the tablet view, what happens is you show both fragments at the same time.
It's like master detail?
Yeah, master detail, basically, right? Or, I think what he's asking is more like detail.
Okay, all right.
And then, like, if you're in, like, the portrait view, you just have, like, a single a detail A and, a detail 1 in one fragment, in the portrait mode. But when you go to tablet, you have, like, detail A, detail B,
Yeah, I gotcha, yep.
So we want the LCE state to be the same as well, even when the fragments become visible at different times. This is like a fantastic question, right? And what this boils down to is like how, if I want the information that's coming down from this view model to be shared across like more than one screen, how do I do this? I think like do you think that's like a fair way to sort of summarize this question?
Yeah, I think so, yeah. Because you could, because the view state could be various different objects. I got it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, this again, like this is more, you can do this in multiple ways, right? Like the one that immediately comes to my mind is I essentially would want to share a view model across both of these. The most immediate thing is I was like, hey, I'm going to just use the same view model. I don't care, right? And the way I would reason this decision out is in my mind, I would actually want to like drive this through like the testing, right? Say I have fragment 1 and fragment 2 in my tablet mode. For all practical purposes, if fragment 1 and fragment 2 are only splitting this view state information and showing them like, to like in an expanded view, and in the portrait mode, you're actually showing all of this content, but just like in a different format and like you're compressing them, I would actually literally use the exact same view model, right? I would not create 2 independent view models or anything. I just have view model, I don't know, stock price view model, stock price display view model. And in fragment 1, I would call out to the same view model, and fragment 2, I'd call out to the same view model. And if both fragments display at the same time, that's fine. You're still listening to the same view model, right? You can use some form of dependency injection or something and make sure that you have the same instance of the view model being used across both fragments. That's like a different question. That's basically just how do I share things between fragments, which is a different question. You could just do that straight away and that's fine, right? Because in the end, if the same view state is consumable by both fragments, just use the same view state. Like I mean, that in my mind, again, this is coming from like the whole startup thing, like that in my mind, that would be the simple thing. I wouldn't want to complicate this by, creating 2 independent view models and then like sharing use cases and stuff, right? Does that make sense as like the first solution?
Yeah, it does. Let me listen to the other ones before I ask any questions.
Okay. The other alternative is, well, if you want to get really like hands down on this, you could, like I mentioned in the recap today, the parts that are common, you could share them as use cases. So the action to the LCE result portion, you can just share that in like either a service object or something else and have 2 different view models. If you want to be really pure of this pattern and have fragment 1 view model, fragment 2 view model, those 2 view models can still share those use cases, right? But I think the follow-up question that might come is, well, what if the view state is really what I care about, right? Like if I want like the view state to be the sort of like the similar thing. Again, like, if the concern is that you're displaying the exact same thing at the same time, I don't think like, again, that's like what you're really talking about is just like sharing those information streams. And sharing those information streams can be done like at different ways, right? Through dependency injection, you can inject like a service object that always like, there's a single instance, and when it returns something, like you have the same thing. The other alternative, the final alternative I can think of is you can compose view models too. So you can have different fragment 1 view model, fragment 2 view model, but they can compose of like, stock price quantity view model. And that view model can basically take in events and like perform the same sort of aspect. So that's like another alternative. In the end, what really should drive this decision, in my opinion, is you need to basically see how you test this thing. Like if you're okay with having just a single view state and you have like exhaustive tests that just cover this, use the same view model. I mean, I don't think that matters. But if these screens are so different that your tests, like the tests look so different between fragment 1 and fragment 2, and it's only 3 or 4 of these states that you're sharing across these, in that case, maybe it does make sense to have them as independent view models. So how would you want to test this? Like, and how do those tests look? Like, I would let that sort of drive the decision of using these view models. Because if you think about it, like that is the whole point of using this pattern. You want to make that aspect easy, the debugging and the testability, right? So let that sort of help drive that decision.
Okay.
Do you think that's like am I missing something here? Like, what are your thoughts?
No, I think you're the end where you talked about, each fragment, has independent suites of tests and so forth. That's kind of what I was thinking of, because when I read the question, I kind of think this as the whole master detail thing, or let's say you're showing Google stock price on the left, and then on the right-hand side on the fragment, and if this was in like landscape mode, on the right-hand side on the tablet, it would show the details about that particular stock or the history or anything like that. So then I think like, all right, well, those two view models would be completely different. Now, there's multiple ways to handle that. I guess you could have all the data within that view model, and if that other fragment is visible, then it could subscribe to it and show the data. If not, it doesn't use that other data. Now that does kind of get away from like, hey, well, in this screen, I don't need these bits. In this screen, I don't need these bits. So you could be polluting your view model a little bit. So I think of it that way. And then I think about, all right, well, maybe what if it is two separate stocks? I'm comparing stocks. I'm comparing Google versus, Microsoft. And I want to see there are two different stock models. Like, how would I implement that? So what is your take on those types of implementations?
I think like that, that in the end like falls back into the DI layer, right? Like the dependency injection layer. Like if you have similar functions but actually different, I think of those as different instances then, right? Like, so maybe you want one view model instance, like don't use a singleton in that case, right? Like, or don't like share those, don't scope those to have the same view model. In that case, create an instance of the view model, but like maybe send in like the Apple stock price, and in the other you send in the Google stock price, and then they'll perform the same thing, like, but they'll be, the data that's coming down the pike is different in that case. But if you want those to be the exact same Google, because we are like tracking this Google stock price like across like 4 different screens, then in that case, like, maybe just use the same view model.
Okay. Yeah.
The same instance of the view model.
This is one of those questions that's like really dependent upon your situation, dependent upon how your app's built, dependent upon how everything's architected. Like, can you even handle this? Like, it really depends,
Yeah. This is like beyond like, this is because like it's the source of information is being shared, right? So like, how do you do that sharing is like really the question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And to be fair, like he follows up with that saying, I'm considering exposing such a straight in a repository whose instance would be accessible by both views via DI implementation, which is like pretty much like a very similar pattern.
Mm-hmm.
He did mention, but that would be odd because I need to expose the LCE state itself as opposed to what I typically expose from a repository, right?
Mm-hmm.
The reason I bring this up is because that's a very good point. What I would suggest is a subtle point here. Like folks think the LCE of state is LCE of the view state. That's actually not what, consciously I've chosen not to do that. Not because it's wrong or anything, but what I've noticed having done that before is composing different LCE of view states is kind of tricky. Also, if you see this pattern, what is exposed from the view model is only an observable of view state, not an observable of LCE of view state. Because at any point of time, I want my screen to basically just tell me exactly what's seeing. If I see a spinner, I should have a field say show spinner. If I have a field that says show text, then I should say show text, and my show spinner should be false. So what you want to come out of the view model is only an observable of a view state, or like, the view state. It shouldn't be an LCE. Where the LCE portion comes in is in the result stage. So when I have the event that's being like, as Alex Dev mentions, at the repository layer, what you're exposing is like the LCE of the result that's being sent down. And that can be shared across because the result is the model sort of layer. It has nothing to do with the view state. The view state should always just be in the view model. The view model should be the only person that knows how to convert that, in quotes, entity or like that model information into visible UI information, because in all likelihood, that's only going to be specific to the screen. So that's why you want that to exist only in the view model, if that makes sense. Do you think I summarized that point?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, at this point, there's so much that's going on. It's like, like I'm thinking about all these different implementations. Like, all right, which one would I use? Would I do that? Well, no, I've never tried that before. Or would that work? And then I'm like, you know how it is. You start getting into the weeds of like, all right, well, how would I implement that? It's some, all the way down to the DI layer. I'm like, all right, I'm in the module. How am I going to implement this in the module? So, yeah, I think there's valid approaches. All the approaches that you've mentioned here are all valid. I think it's just going to take some exploration in regards to, the implementer to see what's going to work best for them.
Got it. The next question is by Calvin Nor. I hope I'm pronouncing. These are nicknames, by the way. So I'm just giving you a run at it. So Calvin Nor on Discord asks this question, right? The first question he says is multiple view states. Assuming you have two APIs fetching from different sources and you need to show both on the same screen, you'd either wait for both to emit and combine them, or have two different sources of truth for different items. Assuming there are two independent lists on screens, which approach would you take? And out of curiosity, how often do you hit more than one API per screen at Instacart? I thought this was like a pretty solid question.
Yeah.
So, do you think like that question sort of like explains it, or do you want to like sort of summarize it in, or like talk about like any specific parts that we have to call out before like I sort of give my 2 cents on this?
No, I think this is just you see this question pop up a lot, especially when you're first getting started with RX. And actually, every time I have to handle it, I have to think it through. And that's, and you could take out the API even out of it. I could just say, I need to connect to something, and I'm two different things, and I'm going to get back an observable of A and an observable of B, and they're going to come in at different times. One could be from file, one can be from API, disk, whatever. And then at that point, do I need to use like a zip operator in RxJava? Do I need to do something different, A and B? What should I, combine latest? What's the approach that I should be using here? And is it very common to have that situation where we're pulling from multiple sources?
Yeah, I mean, you basically just straight up answered this question on point, right? The idea here is like not to do with the architecture pattern, but literally it's such a product question in the end, in my mind, right? And a product question which would eventually lead to you solving it by using one of the operators in RxJava, right? In one of my previous talks, I'll try to like post a link to this. I talked like this is one of the use cases that I talk about where the one you mentioned where like, hey, what if I want to pull this information from the database first, and as the network is completed and it comes down, I want to like pull the results from the network and like replace the DB results with the network, right? How do I do that? I mean, I can tell you, like, it was like 10 minutes of my talk, so I can like point folks towards that. What I do there is I start off with a merge operator, and this is purely mostly an RxJava question, right?
Yeah, it is.
What is interesting is like even with that, it depends on your use case, right?
It does.
Because it depends. How do you want to treat this? Do you want to first always pull from the database, and then after that execute the network request and then show the results? In that case, I would probably use something like concat or concat merge, right? Mm-hmm. Do you want both to just simultaneously happen and then just like collect those results or like filter them out after the fact? Then you would probably use something like merge, right? Mm-hmm. In that question, like again, in the talk, I talk about specifically the use case where I start off with the database results. If my network request comes in, then I want to like swap those results out, right? I want to stop the database and then bring in the network request to like show those results, because what if my network is pretty fast? I got like great connection, right? So that's another use case, and in that I use a combination of like the publish and like different merge operators. Mm-hmm. The other thing recently that I ran into at Instacart is what if I want a use case where like I'm adding a flag where I'm like, hey, I want the database. If the results are available in the database, don't deal with like ignore the network request, right? Because if I have it, like don't even bother making a network request, right? But sometimes I might want to refresh those results and say, no, like don't use the cached results from the database, like refresh that. And for that, I had to use this operator called AMB. And Don, I think if I remember right, you've written a blog post on that, right?
It was one of the first lessons that I did on Caster.io. It was on the AMB operator. Yeah, it was like, years ago.
Yeah. So the AMB operator is what like I would use in that case. And like for folks who are curious, the AMB operator, like, just listen, like watch Don's screencast. It'll probably give you the idea. But if you forcefully want to like dispose of the alternative stream, then you use something like AMB. So in this case, it's not enough for me to I don't want to waste resources by executing the network request. I actively want to dispose it so it doesn't like actually have like a performance sort of hit. In that, or like if I forcefully want to refresh the results, I don't want the database sort of observable to emit results. I want it explicitly disposed of, Mm-hmm. So if that's the case, then I would use something like AMB. So Calvin Orr, great question, but really this is mostly an RxJava question, right? It would depend on, I would hide all of this behind your repository layer and just like allow that to deal with this, right? At that point, it becomes an RxJava question. With respect to this pattern, you're only hitting the repository and it's sending you the LCO results. It doesn't have knowledge about like these multiple operators. And this is exactly like something where I wouldn't keep this in the view model. You don't want your view model to be basically just become a God object of this stuff, right? You want to maybe push that behind a repository and let it deal with however you want to deal with it.
Yeah, definitely. You'd want to, so in short, evaluate the different operators for for combining observables, A and B, combine latest, zip, concat, whatever. See what's going to work best for your situation.
Yeah.
He follows it up though with a kind of a follow up here, and he says, "Why did you choose to expose an RX subject from the view model over just using a live data? I'd assume this would be simpler because I wouldn't need to dispose the descriptions, but I'm curious as to why you chose to do it that way."
Yeah, again, like a good follow-up question. And this goes to what we were saying, right? Like RxJava, do you need RxJava? You don't need RxJava. You can absolutely use live data here. Honestly, I'm just more familiar with RxJava. I've been using RxJava for some time. And this is usually like the argument I make, which is not to say it's a good argument, but if I spent the time to learn RxJava, it just helps my functional sort of like idioms, like, it has improved my understanding of functional programming in some ways. And it's this Swiss Army knife, as Don likes to call it. Having learned RxJava, I can do like all of these things, right? With RxJava in one way or the other. But if I don't have RxJava, then I have to like learn live data. I've not used live data enough, Don, so maybe you can like help me out here. Like, I don't necessarily know if you can like use these sophisticated kind of combinations that we just talked about in the previous sort of example, and you might then need coroutines or something in the background. So you would need multiple things in order to like piece these things together, or you might need data by. Again, I'm out of my depth here with like the details on live data, but personally for me, it's just familiarity. Having learned RxJava, I know how to do these things precisely well with RxJava, so I just use it. That's the only reason. No other better reason per se.
Yeah, I'm not well versed in live data either. If you want to learn a little bit more about it, definitely check out episode 115 with Akshay Chodia, where we talk about the architecture components. And feel free to reach out to him on Twitter. He's very helpful as well. If you have questions, and he's worked with RX and stuff like that. But I'm not versed in that live data stuff. And that some people are probably like, what do you mean? This is like core part of Android. This kind of goes back to the whole episode, which I talk about, like you can't learn everything. The clients that I'm working at right now, we're just not using it. And so it's one of those things like, I'm not using it. I'm probably not going to learn it in depth until I really need to go and learn it. I have read about it. I have, of course, watched the Castro.io course on the architecture components and learned about it, but just haven't had a use case to use it yet.
Yeah, that pretty much sums it up.
He has a final follow-up here where he asks, doing UI stuff in OnResume, I've always gone against this because OnResume can/is called multiple times for any events like alert boxes, obstructing views, blah, blah, blah. But it's definitely more reliable and can get rid of weird lifecycle issues like an activity result and permission stuff. Do you use this pattern at Instacart? And has it led to any weird bugs or performance issues?
Yeah, again, very good question here, right? The way typically that I don't have necessarily, it depends on what you're doing, right? Typically what I do is the view model is created in onCreate. I don't necessarily send events down because really OnResume is where it's like reliably good to display. That's when I know the view is active, so I know I won't run into main thread sort of like exceptions if I'm doing anything. So that's typically how I know in the example, maybe I do it in onCreate or something, but no, actually you do it in OnResume. The reason I don't run into weird performances and like the other stuff that he talks about is because typically I'm good about disposing my UI subscriptions. Like all these things that come like in RxJava, you add these to like disposables or like what they used to call subscriptions. I'm good about like disposing them on pause and like OnResume. Now, if OnResume gets called multiple times, as you say, because I don't know, like you're backgrounding, foregrounding, like you're pausing, and for any other reasons, or like you have alert dialogues, or you have like other things that are like being presented, I personally don't necessarily I trust OnResume to just work. I've not seen any performance differences because again, if the view state is the same and you're reusing the view state, it typically there are like different ways to do it, right? I didn't actually talk about like the whole diffing concept because that's like again adding one more layer of complexity. what you can do is you can have sophisticated diffing algorithms, right? Epoxy is like the library from Airbnb that actually does the diffing. Like, so you can, it's almost like what we have in the React world. They'll only compare the differences that have changed and swap those differences out, right? I know Recycler View has like the
diffutil or something like that.
Yeah, diffutils, the diffutils pattern thing. So you could typically use that, right? The other thing you can do is with view state, you can just use a good old like distinct until changed, like at the very end of your view state. So unless it's changed, it won't just keep emitting. Again, like, but obviously that won't help in this case, because if it's like on resume is explicitly being called and that's why you're making the link, then it probably will be called. But just like, yeah, honestly, we use this like pretty heavily on. I've not necessarily noticed any performance hits. And again, like as the saying goes, unless you actually observe like a performance hit, don't really do the thing that's clean, because on resume is definitely the cleanest way to deal with the UI stuff. What are your thoughts around that?
Anything Android lifecycle related can always be super confusing. And to be honest, the default diagrams that have been developed over the years or have stayed stagnant over the years, should I say, haven't really been that big of a help, because you have the activity and then you had the fragment. And then there was always these really weird edge cases, like, well, what task mode did you start this in? And was it a single top versus, a single, whatever they are? And I always felt myself getting confused. So is on resume the right place, or should I be using on start, not stop? What's the right place to do this? I think this really depends on what you're trying to do. Should things happen at these particular times, and understanding the life cycle is key. Thankfully, one of the DevRels, Jose Alceria, I know I mispronounced your last name. I'm sorry, Jose. He has created some fantastic Android lifecycle cheat sheets that are on the Android developers Medium blog, which we'll put into the show notes.
Absolutely.
They have ones that just do regular activities, the fragments, etc. I really highly recommend that you read through those in detail. And the diagrams are much easier to understand. And I actually kind of wish that Google would just replace the ones on the developer site with the ones he's created, because they're way better.
100%, yeah.
But that's where I would go. And do I encounter issues sometimes on resume? Of course I do, yeah. And especially when you're using things, you're disposing of subscriptions. Am I disposing too early? Oops, this got cleaned up too late or whatever. And it's just one of those things where you have to kind of understand what's happening. But one of the things that's helped has been the diagrams, as well as the lifecycle components that are with the Jetpack stuff. So that's been super useful, as I can just say, hey, do certain things on destroy or on stop, etc., which have been awesome.
And again, with the whole debugging thing, this is where it gets useful. If you have debug statements whenever you have the event come in and your result go out, and you also have debug statements when your screen on resumes, on creates, and on starts. Like, if we have like this debugging mode flag where if you flip it on, then it just like dumps like every single thing. When you're debugging and you're running into like weird issues, this is super helpful, because then you can say, oh, wait, on resume happened, then what, the view state was emitted before that or after that, or like, the event got spawned afterwards. Like, that's weird. That shouldn't happen. And that's how you can like debug your way, refer to Jose's cheat sheets, like, figure out like the crazy combination of how these operators work, and then make sure that's when it fires, So that's like, yeah, that's how I would approach it. And Jose has done a fantastic job. Like you said, again, like, you're absolutely right. Like, I just feel like, now I'm angry that he didn't like have this at the beginning, right? Because all those like precious years and like hairs lost pulling out, like, from my head, thinking about like how these things work. If he had that early on, that would be a godsend. But better late than never.
Okay, so we have another question here. This is from Pablisco on Discord, and it is listening to episode 148, and you talk about LCE. I've used this pattern before, and it's quite useful. The only question I have is, how do you model reloading, for example, with previous content and pagination?
This is basically a great question. Like, the more I think about this, right, I feel this again is more like logic. I don't necessarily think this is like to do with the pattern, because like with respect to the pattern, what happens is because it's an observable, like, don't ever think it's a single. It doesn't terminate, right? So you can always keep sending down the different results, which in turn would get transformed into the view state and be sent down to the activity, right? So the first part I would say don't worry about it. Like even if you did achieve these things, like, you had model reloading or different things or pagination, it should all just, in quotes, work. Because these are observables, they're listening, right? As long as you're listening to this view state, like anything you send down will work. The second more interesting part of this question, again, goes more into like the implementation of this, right? How do you actually do model reloading? I mean, you can do this like through multiple ways, right? It depends on how you basically need a true constantly emitting observable, right? In my mind, one of the ways I would think about, like the first thing that immediately comes to mind is, well, you could have like a streaming socket or something, right? If you have like a streaming network data source, you can you basically map that into your LCE and then like send that down, right? Again, it also depends on how you want to treat the LCE. Maybe you want to only show the loading state for the very first time, and if you have content coming down, like you just keep the existing content and don't change anything. Maybe you want to indicate to the user that you're actually pulling that data. If that's the case, the next time your streaming request starts, then send down a loading object, right? So again, that's more of a product question. Just because you have an LCE doesn't necessarily mean serially you should only have L, C, or E, It could be L and then C, You could have another C come in. Or you could just have L, C, and then have another L come in and then another C. L standing for loading and C standing for content. So again, it would depend. Typically, like to give you to answer Pablo's question, like specifically, one of the things that we do is we use Room's database. Because we use the Room database, the advantage is it's when you query Room, what you get is a flowable of a data source, right? And these are like true observables. So anytime that database object changes, like your flowable emits the new data, right? And this, I think, is like actually, I think Dan Liu maybe had like a similar concept that he talked about in an episode with us here, where essentially you want just the UI only, or the repository only listens to the database. Now you could pull network requests in the background. You can maybe have a polling endpoint that does something. You can have a streaming request, and that all that does is it just stores it back onto the database, right? Like this Room database or any other database that you choose, like SQLite is, or SQLite is also like pretty awesome. Like they had an update recently. You just listen to this database then. Like, so the network does all its like shabam, stores it in the database, and all you're doing is you're listening to the database with an LCE that sends it down an LCE, right? That obviously makes the L part a little tricky, like, because then you wouldn't necessarily know if you're if there's like another thing loading, unless that the repository that you hit has some notion that, oh, it's being pulled from the network layer, So again, the implementation details it depends on how you want to implement that, right? If you care about like listening to the loading state, then probably what you're doing is like directly querying like a network request or something. All right, Dan. I think we've covered some of like the interesting questions that came up. There did like a bunch of other questions also did come up. And again, folks, Pablisco, Arc, Costeria, Eugene, Curious Techizan, EOIN_A, Sumit, all on the Discord channel. You guys guys and gals asked fantastic questions. What I'll do now is, obviously we could keep asking these questions and go on probably for like another whole episode. But I'm the hope with this episode was like by surfacing some of these questions, it would help sort of establish this pattern or like add more depth to this pattern. And I think like some of the questions that came in were pretty solid that way. What I'll do is Don and I will actually, we have a compiled list of some of these questions. We'll ping you folks directly in the Discord channel and maybe give you an answer if your question was not answered. Some of these were already answered, so we don't want to necessarily go into the details again. But again, thank you so much for asking these questions, and we'll definitely like ping the answers in the channel. But at this point, I think that's a good place to sort of wrap it up. What do you think, Don?
I think it's great. Yeah, there's a lot of questions out there, so we'll ping you offline, and thank you all for asking the questions that you have so far. We appreciate it greatly and are super grateful for you listening and asking the questions.
Alrighty, folks. Don, if people want to find out what you do, getting up at 5 a.m. in the morning and going with your routine, or 4:30, in fact. What's a good place to find that out?
You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram under the same handle at Don Felker. Sometimes I'll post pictures of my alarm clock. So exciting. Not really. Just kidding. Kaushik, if folks want to follow you and see what's going on with you, where can they learn more about what's your happenings?
I am Kaushik Gopal on Twitter and on Instagram. So that's typically where I have most of my stuff. I'm also trying to get back into blogging again. So blog.kaush.co is a good place to go. So yeah, folks can find out all the crazy things I do there. Thank you all so much for listening, and we will catch you in the next episode.
Before we get going, we'd like to thank our sponsor for this episode, and that is nevercode.io. If you're looking for a continuous integration platform that supports Flutter right out of the box, even with Bitbucket and GitLab integration coming soon, you'll want to check out nevercode.io. They also recently released the automatic code signing for iOS, which allows you to not have a Mac to develop a iOS app from your Flutter project, which is awesome. If you're interested, go ahead and check out nevercode.io for a 14-day free trial. And if you're interested in CodeMagic, please go to codemagic.io. Thanks, Nevercode.
I want to thank Sentry for sponsoring today's show. Their tagline is, "Your code is broken, let's fix it together." They're a super cool crash reporting service that gives you all the helpful details that you need when detecting and fixing errors in your application. Don't wait for your users to report your errors and crashes. Use Sentry to catch them earlier. Check them out at sentry.io/for/Android. Once again, because Sentry is a common word, I want to make sure you get it right. Sentry.io. My thanks to Sentry for sponsoring today's show. That's it for the show, folks. Fragmented is hosted by Don Felker and me, Kaushik Gopal. We edit and produce all the episodes here on Fragmented. Sarah the Amazing Jackson from the Spec Network helps with production assistance and wraps our final mix. Our theme and ad music is by the national recording artist Blueprint from Weightless Recordings. You can find more Fragmented episodes at fragmentedpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you in the next episode.